And we are very fortunate today to have Melissa Laundry with us. Um, Melissa is a licensed professional counselor. She's a certified EMDR therapist and the owner of Body and Mind Healthy. She has a passion for aiding individuals in overcoming trauma, depression, and anxiety. Her therapeutic approach is person-centered, focusing on empowering individuals to direct their own path to recovery. She has extensive service experience in Southwest Virginia, and Melissa is committed to fostering resilience and healing within her community. Of note, Melissa is also an MRC volunteer. I reached out to Melissa to sort of facilitate this for us because Adrenia, who is with VDH, she is the training coordinator and who is also assisting us today. um, and thank you both for being here. But we worked together to do a series of trainings shortly after COVID, and I was very impressed with the portion that Melissa brought to the table. I really think she had some excellent information to share, not only about how we can better assist those we serve while on deployment, but also um, sort of sort of bridging the understanding between what we may be experiencing as far as stress responses is not too terribly different from those we may be serving. And so she's going to sort of talk about how it is that we can look after ourselves, check in with ourselves, while also helping to support those in the community affected by disasters or critical incidents. So again, I thank you all for being here. All of your lines are muted, and please take advantage of the chat if you think of questions, and if you're like me, you might forget before the end of it. I'll be monitoring the chat for Melissa, and at the end of her presentation, we will have some time for Q&A. So again, thank you all for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to Melissa.
Wow, thank you so much, Stephanie. That's so kind. And I always really do enjoy working with you and Adrenia. I think that it's amazing that the work that you guys do and the work that the volunteers do, and I'm happy to be a part of it. So thank you for having me. I'm really passionate and excited to talk about this topic. I could talk about trauma and coping and resiliency, I think, all day, every day, and not get sick of it. But I'm a licensed professional counselor, like Stephanie said, and I do EMDR, which is a very trauma-focused type of therapy. And I've been doing EMDR consistently since 2016. So, and then before that, I did a lot of CBT and was trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's mainly just used for kids. They're working on it translating to adults. But right now, for adults, EMDR is one of the central forms of therapy that we do for trauma. And it can be done if you're just having a stress response, and it can be done if you have acute stress disorder, and it can be done if you have PTSD, which kind of brings us to our training objectives, because we're going to be talking about the difference between all three of those things. And so it's really important to know that anybody can have a stress response, anybody can slip into acute stress disorder, and anyone can find themselves into PTSD, depending on the type of trauma and their prior experiences. And we can talk about what that looks like for each type of person, and then how different factors kind of influence that. But we're also going to talk about how we can really demonstrate and practice today for ourselves self-soothing techniques. So the best way to teach somebody else how to do these techniques is if you have practiced them yourself too. So there's a lot of big integration of what you're hearing today that you can use to help people who are surviving a disaster during a disaster response, and the things that you can be doing for yourself as well. So I like to think of it as like, I want to show up in therapy having practiced the tools that I'm giving people, so that way I feel very authentic in the way that I'm delivering things. And I feel like people can really feel the difference when you practice these things, or you also have the humanity of getting out of practice of these things too and have to go back to practicing them again. So I think that when we're talking about disaster response and we're learning these things, we can bring our authentic selves and we can bring some of our life experiences because they can be used to help other people with our knowledge and education and training too. So we're going to be learning all of that and then also talking about building coping skills. And I really talk and really tell my clients too and other people in my life that we have to have a toolbox of a lot of different coping skills, not just one thing we always do. Because sometimes that one thing that we always do stops working or it doesn't fit because we can't use a hammer for every solution when we're doing something for woodworking or building something. Like a hammer's just one tool in the toolbox, just like our coping skills, deep breathing or tapping is just one tool in the toolbox. So we talk about all the different tools that we can add to the toolbox. I'm really excited about this and I really am happy to be here. So we'll dive right in. Really just going over the nature of disasters and how they have an emotional toll. So whether disasters are man-made or unexpected or overwhelming, they can significantly disrupt communities and people's lives. The emotional toll that they exert on both our first responders and the survivors can be profound and often leading to lasting psychological impacts. So we just want to really, oops, my bad. We really want to expand um, what we can think about the different types of nature, natural disasters or man-made disasters or pandemics or health crises. And we recently have, gone through COVID, all of us, which is a new experience, all of us to manage. We had talked about the possibility of a pandemic, but then now in our generation, we've experienced it. And so that's a little bit different when you firsthand experience it versus just like a concept that we know that could happen. Then we also have recent man-made disasters. I'm thinking of the school shooting in Georgia that recently happened. Um, these different types of disasters can have a huge impact, not just on people who experienced it, but the people who witnessed it, the people who responded, the family members involved, whether that's the people who they live with or extended family members. All walks of the community are affected by man-made disasters a lot of times, even if they weren't the person directly involved with it. And then natural disasters like hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, wildfires, tornadoes, all of these can lead to like big impacts in people's lives. It's really sudden with a lot of times no preparation. A lot of people are displaced, there's injury, there's loss of life. So a lot of these disasters can look differently, we respond differently to them, but they can produce the same effects on people's lives, whether they are directly involved or they're kind of in the bystander or in the community trauma. So there's these different types of disasters, and each of them will have their own set of psychological responses. So those can be short-term shock to long-term trauma, depending on the person, depending on what they experienced, and depending on the person's history. I like to explain it like if two people are in a car accident together, one person might get PTSD, one person might not get PTSD because the one person who does get PTSD has a history of trauma. So if you have a history of trauma, it increases your risk of PTSD and a subsequent trauma, no matter what that trauma is, versus someone who hasn't had a lot of trauma in their life. They might experience the same car accident, the same set of circumstances, but not develop PTSD because they don't have those higher risk factors. So it's just dependent on the person a lot of times, but we have to be prepared because one, we don't know how we're going to respond in times of crisis or experience a traumatic event. And then we also don't know how to predict a lot of times what other people will do. So we kind of have to use that universal precautions and just anticipate that most people are going to get PTSD even if they don't, because if we can get ahead of the PTSD, we can a lot of times prevent it from progressing to that point. So the immediate impact on survivors. So survivors of that disaster usually experience an array of emotions due to sudden or uncontrollable nature of events. So a lot of the key emotional reactions can be shock and denial. So In the immediate aftermath, survivors may feel numb, dazed, disoriented. They're really processing the reality of the disaster, and that usually leads the brain to temporarily shield them from the full emotional impact. So the shock and denial is your brain's way of protecting you from going into a full mental health crisis. So it's easier to feel numb and out of it versus feeling the intensity of the emotions right after a traumatic event. A lot of times people will feel fear and anxiety. So they might fear for their personal safety, the safety of their loved ones, uncertainty about the future, and this can also lead to anxiety or a heightened state where they're really feeling like there's not any predictability in their life at this time and don't really know when life's going to get back to normal. Because if you kind of think of these disasters, it completely can change your worldview of the safety that we presumably live in every day. So when we're thinking about disasters, we're beginning to think about it as this huge loss, and there's going to be anxiety and there's going to be grief associated with that because it's a loss of that safety, it's a loss of loved ones at times, of homes, of livelihoods. It is the complexity of the grief of the loss that really adds to people's sadness and their anxiety. So it can kind of have a compounding effect. So, and we really can't say like, okay, well, we had this loss and we should be over it in X amount of months or X amount of years. That's really not how trauma works. Sometimes it's going to take you a couple weeks to feel better, sometimes a couple months, sometimes a couple years. It depends on the severity of the trauma, the severity of the losses, and then, whether there's chronic PTSD afterwards and how it continues to affect the person and how they continue to be triggered in their daily life. So it can completely shift somebody's worldview, completely change their lives. And we have to be aware of that and know that when we're responding, that we might be seeing the very beginnings of this. And it can look different for different people. Because some people are going to feel angry about the causes of the disaster. Maybe they're thinking like people weren't prepared enough, or maybe they're feeling really guilty because they survived and other people didn't, which is known as survivor's guilt. I can definitely see that the people who were recently involved in a school shooting would be very angry at the person who caused that disaster. That would make complete sense. And people would be angry for people not taking, precautions in the sense of maybe a crisis if they felt like things weren't done, in time or fast enough. Then there's also feelings of helplessness and vulnerability. Again, going back to like disasters and trauma is a loss of safety a lot of times. And so when there's a loss of safety, you feel very helpless, you feel very powerless, you feel very vulnerable. Because a lot of these times when we're in our normal everyday lives, we feel very much in control. We feel like things go according to our plan most of the time. Instead of little hiccups, major like a disaster happens, it completely disrupts the worldview that we have that we're in control and that we are safe. And so there's this really big feeling of I'm helpless, I'm powerless, and I'm very vulnerable. And I'm not safe, and other people aren't safe either. And so that can be very deeply distressing as an emotional experience. So a lot of times when we are exposed to a traumatic scene, we might witness, traumatic sights, like injured people, deceased people, widespread destruction or chaos. And so we have to take that into effect too. It's not just what happened, but also what the person has saw, what they witnessed, what they heard. And that can have an effect on their trauma as a result. And it can also have an effect on us as whether we're therapists like myself who hear about it later, or if you're responding directly to a disaster, it still has an effect on us being being there and helping people. It's kind of like it's both, where we feel so grateful to be able to do this for other people and we're happy to do this service. And it also weighs on us because we have like this bystander effect where our sense of safety is also disrupted at times too. Because when we hear these things happen to other people, we then feel like it's more likely to happen to us. And we can also take on the emotional, feelings that other people might be experiencing too. So it's good to know that, they might not have been hit with a bullet, they might not have been harmed at all, but they're seeing what the aftermath is and seeing the sights associated with the disaster can be traumatic of itself, or even hearing about the trauma or the disaster afterwards can be traumatic as well. And then two, people involved with disasters, they might also feel empathy or compassion fatigue. If you've been in a community-wide disaster and you're giving all this compassion and empathy out to other people, and whether you're the person involved or a bystander or you're someone who's responding to this, if you're doing that out of a good reason, you have good intentions, you want to help people, but oftentimes we might do it a little bit too much because we might be, especially if you're involved with a disaster, distracting from our own pain, and not really wanting to deal with our own stuff that might be coming up, so we help other people. And that can lead to burnout as well and compassion fatigue. And it can also happen on the other side of this first responders, where you're constantly seeing and absorbing the suffering of other people. And you really can become numb or distant as a defense mechanism to kind of be like pushing those emotions away so we don't have to feel them, and feel that grief and that loss of safety for ourselves when hearing or seeing something that's traumatic. So I've touched on this a little bit, but we can have secondary traumatization. So if we are continually hearing, or even someone else involved with the disaster or a family member of a disaster, they're continually hearing the stories about the survivors, about what they witnessed, about how distressing it was, it can really bring up a sense of trauma as if we experienced it ourselves, and the symptoms appear very similar to PTSD. And then also, the stress of responsibility is another huge emotional toll. So if we want to, again, go back to the recent example of a school shooting, a lot of those teachers, a lot of those people who protected their students, they did what was right, and they were able to be safe, and they were able to take responsibility for their students. They might still feel a huge sense of responsibility, and thinking the normal thought that most people do when they're involved in a disaster is, what could I have done different to make this so it didn't happen? And that's going to be a huge thing that's weighing on the school board. It's going to be weighing on the management and the administration. It's going to be weighted on like the police, the community members. There's so many different people who are going to take this on as an emotional toll from being involved in a disaster, but may not even recognize it um, until maybe like later on, if they get in therapy or if they do a lot of internal work to really know, like, gosh, I feel like overly responsible for this, and I feel like it's my fault, which is a very common reaction that people have when they're involved in a traumatic experience. They do take on that ownership, they do take on that responsibility because they don't want to see this happen to anybody else. So they're thinking, if I could have prevented it, all this wouldn't happen, and I need to prevent it again, which is in part true, but it's also we all are doing the best we can in the moment. But that does come with a lot of feelings of inadequacy and a lot of feelings of guilt, which can also lead to more feelings of PTSD in the future. And then we also have moral injury. So when people are involved in a disaster and they're put in a position where they're forced to make a very difficult decision that go against their values, or if they witness suffering that they can't alleviate, then this can cause a long-term emotional distress, such as moral injury. And the moral injury is like, this shouldn't have happened. I protected this person, but I couldn't protect these people. And so a moral injury is when it goes against our values. I said, like, I'm a protecting person, or I'm going to make sure I always do what's right. There's a lot of different examples. Doctors experience moral injury at times when they're responding to traumatic events where they're only one person, for example, if they're placed in a war zone or a disaster, they have to very quickly decide who are they going to save and who do they have to not get to in that moment. And sometimes those are life or death decisions, but they can't be everywhere at once if they're limited in staff. And that leads to a moral injury because they feel like they should be able to do it all. They should be able to be, the superhero that saves everybody. But at the end of the day, we're all just human. And so when we can't fulfill those values, those good things that we want to do because of difficult situations and difficult decisions, that results in a moral injury and takes an emotional toll and also can lead to PTSD. So PTSD is characterized by recurring intrusive thoughts, nightmares, flashback, emotional numbness, and these can persist for months or even years after an event. So we have a good sense of, if you have a history of trauma, you're probably more likely to develop PTSD, but it really can depend on the person and their resiliency and their ability to cope and the support that they have around them. Another long-term side effect on survivors, and this can also be a result of PTSD. A lot of people who have PTSD also have depression. But sometimes if you've been involved with a traumatic event and you don't have PTSD, but you do have depression, that can also happen as well. So depression is the chronic sadness, a loss of interest in daily activities, fatigue, and feelings of hopelessness that can follow a disaster, especially if that person lost loved ones and especially if they lost their home, or had a huge disruption in their day-to-day activities where, they feel overwhelming feelings of grief and loss, and then that can develop into depression because a lot of times grief and loss, yes, is a part of life and then we all experience it, and that if it continues beyond a certain point and it escalates in its symptoms, that can turn into depression. So, like survivors, responders are also susceptible to depression and to PTSD, and it can actually emerge right after the initial disaster or after they've had some time to process the experiences. So it may not happen right afterwards. There can be a delay onset in both depression and PTSD. And then survivors are more likely to experience burnout afterwards. So when they go back to work or they go back to their normal day-to-day lives they had before the disaster, they may be more susceptible to burnout, which is just emotional and physical exhaustion, like detachment from work, a sense of ineffectiveness. They might struggle to return to their normal duties after exposure to the disasters. So that's another thing that we can let people know to look out for when we're responding, saying like, keep your eyes out for burnout, keep your eyes out for depression symptoms, keep your eyes out for PTSD, substance abuse, and anxiety, because those can have a delayed onset after a traumatic event. And giving people the information that can be really helpful so they know like, oh, they said that this might actually happen afterwards and it could take a couple months to develop and it's still related to this traumatic event that I experienced. Because I think a lot of times people think, well, it's been 3 months, it's been 6 months, I should be good. And then all of a sudden, they have anxiety or they have a substance use problem and they're like, I don't know where it came from. It just came out of nowhere. But once you start asking a lot of questions, a lot of times you can find some traumatic events or events that would be very triggering or upsetting to them that likely led to the cause of the symptoms. But anxiety disorders, you would look for like hypervigilance, panic attacks, generalized anxiety. All of these things are very common. And hypervigilance is like being excessively aware of the environment around us, or even maybe even having like an exaggerated startle response. So if like a door slams, they like jump up and they're scared really easily, even though they're not emotionally scared, like their body is responding in a way that it's afraid because the way that we store trauma is in our body. So our body might be telling us there's still some things to be working on, or maybe emotionally or cognitively, we don't have that awareness yet. And the same thing goes like when we're looking at someone who might develop a substance use problem afterwards, their body is dysregulated. Their body is not feeling very good, and using alcohol or drugs or prescription medications afterwards helps their body to calm down. So they think, oh, this is helping. I feel better. And then it turns into an addiction because they're utilizing that to calm their body because they don't have the awareness of their emotional state or their emotional toll that the trauma has had on them. So there's also something called cumulative stress. And so this can happen with both survivors and with responders. So even if you're not feeling like, it's just this one thing, it's okay. Sometimes there's things piled on things, piled on things, piled on things. There's a lot of different factors in our life that can make something that we think we're going to get over really quickly a lot bigger because everything is happening all at once and all at the same time. And it can be very overwhelming to our mind, but it can be very overwhelming to our body and our nervous system, especially. And that can make it very hard to get back into a regulated state. So, some of the things that might be weighing on people, like for example, if they're working long hours, they've not been sleeping well, they don't have a lot of resources, such as, um, like for example, if it's like an EMT responding to something and they run out of bandages or gauze, or they don't have enough supplies. It's like another stress on top of an already stressful situation that's just compounding on it. And then thinking about any personal sacrifices that they might have been making. So thinking about the teachers who, maybe in the example of the school shooting, who have been spending all this time prepping their plans for the class and learning, and they've done all these trainings on safety, and so they've made all these personal sacrifices of working overtime and putting all this hours, and then something like this happens and that lesson plan is now out the window. Like you have to kind of look at, they've spent all this time putting this in there and now they're like, I don't know how I'm going to cope with this. I don't know how I'm going to help my kids cope with this. I've also wasted all this time on this lesson plan that now I can't even use. And so the personal sacrifice is just another layer on top of the trauma. And there's so many different layers when you're working with someone or experiencing or talking with someone with trauma. It's not just the one thing that happened. It's all these different things that are all connected together. And you also have to consider the cultural or language barriers. So imagine how hard it is with someone who is English speaking and having a disaster in our country. Now compound that with someone who is not, in the same culture and does not have the same language. It makes the trauma even more complicated and complex because there's these additional barriers. And so it's a cumulative stress. So if the more cumulative the stress that they have in their life, they're more likely to experience a more severe trauma response as a result of the disaster. So I promise to talk about the differences between a trauma response and acute stress disorder and PTSD. I like to think of it as like a continuum. And so that's why I wanted to lay it out on the screen like this. The trauma response is like the baseline. If you put anybody in a stressful situation or traumatic event or disaster, they're going to have some type of trauma response. And so it might just be, fear, anxiety, it could be disorientation. For someone who's responding, it could just be anxiety. That's still a trauma response. And you have to be like aware of how we're feeling in that moment and how we can, manage our own feelings while we're also helping somebody else. But it's important to, the way that I look at it is that, even as a therapist, I'm doing trauma therapy with people. So we're talking about their trauma. I might notice inside of myself, like ding, 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 this is something that I probably need to work on in my own therapy because it's touching on something that's happened in my life. And so I can't address it right there with that person because I'm helping somebody. But I will take a note of it and say, I'm going to go back to that with my therapist because I want to make sure I'm monitoring my reactions while I'm also taking care of somebody else. So that could be something that could be really helpful for you to do as well when you're noticing you're responding to a disaster, is saying, like, I'm having my awareness of the person in front of me and I'm putting my outward attention and making sure that I'm attending to them well and professionally. But inside of me, I also have to have this dual awareness of the other person and myself. So that way I can say, well, this is like bringing this up for me. I need to attend to that later and make sure that I do that later. So that's going to help you to be able to stay in a volunteer role, because you won't get burnout as much, because if you're taking care of your own reactions, then I think it'll help you to not develop any long-lasting disorders or dysfunction from the good work that you're doing. So something just to be aware of. But other trauma reactions, I mean, some people, when they've experienced a trauma, I mean, it might seem like they have a mental illness or they are like very, very ill at the time, but when you are put into a place where of shock and you don't know what just happened and you're really trying to figure out, what happened, why did it happen, what could I have done, it's my fault, like all of these different factors are going on at the same time. The person could be completely mute and unable to talk. And then that's just their initial trauma response and reaction. But later, as they feel more comfortable and safe, they are able to talk. You're seeing, like, okay, this person isn't like in a catatonic state and they don't have this huge mental health issue. It's that they're going through a normal trauma response and they're coming back to themselves with given some time and some comfort and safety. And so we won't want to make like an initial judgment to say like, oh, this person's definitely going to have PTSD or this person's definitely going to have this or they definitely are mentally ill. They're just kind of like saying like, this is a response. If this isn't their normal, and you can even ask them like, if this isn't your normal, then that's okay. We can kind of see like what things best help them and give them some ideas and what they can try and do that in a very helpful way without pathologizing the person and without making them feel like something terrible is wrong with them, because we don't want to accidentally put that into somebody who's already really anxious and vulnerable and they're thinking like, oh my gosh, it is really bad. Like, because there's some people who are super they can be very anxious and very high functioning, but you give them a thought like there's something wrong with them and they will run wild with it. And we want to make sure that, we're comforting and we're giving them information, but also saying like it might happen and it might not happen. You're going to be the best person to monitor, and here is what you should be looking for going forward. And here's the resources that you need if you're seeing some of these things come up. So that the initial trauma reaction can be for everyone. It won't go into acute stress disorder until 2 to 4 weeks after the traumatic event. And at that point, that's when we're going to see some intrusive memories, avoidance, dissociation. And dissociation is kind of like zoning out. The person just isn't there. They're somewhere in their head and they don't really have a lot of awareness of the outside world. And that could also look like, things don't seem real, derealization, or depersonalization, where they don't feel like they're their own person. Some people have even described it as like they can see themselves sitting in the chair and they're like floating ahead or above, and looking at themselves. They just aren't really in the present moment in their mind. They don't have the dual awareness like we have in our day-to-day functioning, where we're aware of the outside world and we're aware of what's going in inside internally. ASD, or acute stress disorder, also has a heightened arousal. So it's like they're more aware, they have that exaggerated startle response. They might have difficulties with sleep as well, due to either the nightmares or flashbacks or just insomnia in general that can come along with the trauma after a traumatic event. But a lot of times with acute stress disorder, it happens within the first 2 to 4 weeks, but it resolves itself before 3 months post-trauma. So once we get into the 3-month mark after a traumatic event, and we're seeing the signs and symptoms of PTSD, which is like a persistent, you're experiencing the trauma through flashbacks, through nightmares, through even it could be like a flashback where they're seeing the trauma play out again in their mind, or they might even have an emotional flashback where like all the emotions come flooding back to the time when the trauma happened. And it just feels like they're going, a lot of times people are like, oh, I feel like I'm going crazy. And I'm like, no, you're having a flashback. And it could be you see the thing, you see what happened again, or you just experience the same feelings over again and you've been triggered. It's not that you're crazy, it's likely that you have been triggered by something that's reminded your brain of this. And so we have to kind of get into the mindset of like, you're not crazy, you are triggered by something. We find out what the trigger is and we can work through it. So PTSD is going to happen 90 days after an event, and it can severely debilitate somebody. It makes the person feel like they're always going to be like this. that they aren't going to get better, any better, that they're always going to have these like sensitivities to triggers, that they're, you know, going to have disruptions in their mood. Sometimes they have angry outbursts or more irritability. They're having difficulty with eating, they're having difficulty with sleeping. It affects like most areas of their life. And then if that trauma was man-made or came from a person, then we also have this difficulty with trusting people with PTSD. And so trusting that the world is safe, trusting with that other people are safe. And so it can make having relationships or even friendships or any type of like coworker, it just depends on the relation to the person who caused the trauma. It can make it very difficult to re-engage in those situations because, think about a coworker who goes and does something to their workplace environment and causes a lot of death and harm. Those coworkers now might be very distrustful of future coworkers because they're like, I didn't see the signs of this coworker, or I did, and I don't think I did enough to prevent it, and they blame themselves. Then likely they're going to have difficulty in relationships with coworkers in the future because it's going to be very difficult for them to trust that one, it's a safe environment, and two, that the people that they're working with are safe people. And so the PTSD can have a huge impact on people's ability to work and have relationships, function in day-to-day life. Again, it can just really disrupt someone's life entirely. So when we're thinking about personal trauma, we also have to think about, you know, what they just experienced with a disaster, what their upbringing has been, and what their prior exposure and their responses to other traumas what does that look like? So we can kind of get a better idea of people or a better understanding and have more compassion for folks when we kind of think about these different factors. So one of the biggest factor is that the role of the personal trauma. So if they've already experienced significant or if they already have PTSD from their experiences before, they're going to have a lot harder time with a more recent trauma or a more recent disaster. On the one sense, a lot of people who have PTSD and experience another traumatic event, they may be like, well, I've survived the last one, I'll survive this one. And they might very much appear like they're fine and they're just numb to it. But a lot of times they're going to have a more delayed reaction because their body's already gone into that defense mechanism, like I'm just not going to deal with it. And they'll deal with it later. So you might see a more delayed response with someone who has PTSD because initially they're going to go into fight or flight quicker. They're probably going to be great in the midst of the crisis. But then afterwards they'll struggle more with it because then again, it'll bring up a lot of more triggers about the world not being safe and people not being safe. But then you also have to look at, how did they grow up? What are the family dynamics that they experienced? Some people experience a very chaotic childhood and upbringing and didn't have secure attachments with their parents. So the people who have like an insecure attachment, like anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, or fearful, dismissive attachment or disorganized attachment, people who have the insecure attachments are going to struggle a little bit more because they already have the sense of loss, the sense of abandonment, the sense of people are not to be trusted, people are not safe. And so that's going to affect their response to people in the midst of a disaster versus someone who has a secure attachment. So if you're noticing maybe someone's very walled off, they don't want to talk to you, they don't feel like you feel like they're like very distrustful. It may just be that they have a very, avoidant type of attachment style, and they don't trust people initially. It takes them a long time to get to know somebody and trust them, and that's okay. But you just have to be aware, like it's likely not personal, and it can be an effect of the matter of their attachment style, and that attachment style is also going to affect their recovery from the traumatic event. Because if you're avoidant of relationships and deep connections, then it's going to be hard to get support from people in your life following a disaster. A lot of times they're like hyper independent, they don't want anybody's help. And so that could have an effect on how they cope with a disaster and whether or not they develop PTSD. Some other factors can be that they have, parental roles and norms and family roles. There might have been a lot of, risk and danger associated with family growing up or relationships or people in general. If they had a very chaotic life or unsafe environment growing up, they're going to be more distrustful of other people. Okay. So prior exposure to disasters, they're going to have a more different emotional response than people who have experienced an event the first time. They're going to shape it differently. So they might be desensitized, like I said, more resilient at the face of it. But they sometimes they are more resilient and they do get through things a lot quicker because they always have like this worse trauma sometimes to compare it to. And we kind of see that with the people who survived the Holocaust. They go on to write about like if I can get through that, I can get through anything. And so they're using that traumatic experience as a way to say like I'm resilient. I've survived this one thing. I'm going to survive all these other things too. And so they have this very determined um, mindset about them, which is admirable. And also, there's a lot of loss and grief there too, because we should not be forced to be resilient in what we've experienced. So um, it's a little, again, it's dual natured. The people who have experienced numerous crises, they're going to have more likely to have the burnout and compassion fatigue. Their capacity to care and engage emotionally can be diminished, and it might lead to more emotional exhaustion, detachment, and frustration. And again, they might compare their reactions, they might compare the disasters. It just kind of depends. It can serve them well, it can hinder them somewhat and undermine or make them to underestimate the severity of what just happened to them. It might lead them to minimize the impacts of it. Um, but I think it's just something to be aware of that we can have that comparison reaction. And it can be good and it can turn out not so well depending on the person. And people who survive those crises or prior traumas, they're going to have hopefully they're going to have more effective coping strategies. They're going to know how to have that emotional regulation. They're going to know how to seek support, especially if they were resilient. They've been doing well in their recovery from the first trauma or the other traumatic experiences. We can definitely see that they are well equipped because they've done the work, they've been through therapy, they've explored their coping skills, they know themselves really well. They're going to be just fine. They're going to know what to do next, or at least know the resources and figuring out what to do next. There's also people who've experienced lots of trauma and then they didn't pick up these healthy coping skills. They might have picked up really maladaptive coping mechanisms like avoidance or aggression or a substance abuse problem. And these habits could resurface under the stress of a new disaster. So it just depends on the person and what they've experienced, and really listening to their experience and how they're interpreting the current event, determine like how we can either do better this time with recovery from a traumatic event, or if we need to do the same things that we did before. But it's really going to depend on the person. Then there's the professional and background and experiences. So, healthcare workers, first responders, they're already going to have the training to handle high stress situations, and it gives them tools to manage these. And they also have a higher risk of that cumulative stress. So it's a little bit of both. So if you're responding to a disaster where you're talking with, first responders, you're talking with medical professionals, on the first surface, they're probably going to say like they know what to do, they're going to be fine. And still you can still offer new ideas for different ways to cope with the trauma and the disaster, because they don't really, there's no way that anyone can know anything. And I think that your job is to listen to what their plan is and think of like, well, you might want to add this or consider this, or here's some other resources that you might just want to take under consideration. But I think that it can be really hard to work with our healthcare providers and healthcare workers and our first responders and even mental health professionals because they have all the training to go through the trauma, yet they're still human and they might need some assistance too. But I think those folks, plus the military and our veterans, are less likely to ask for help or want to receive help, because I think there's also this effect that happens that says, like, well, I have this training, I have this knowledge, I've had this experience, and you need to go help other people because they don't have that. And so they have this kind of like a sense of, I can handle it on my own, but these people can't. So I'm not as deserving of help as these other people. And so knowing that they might have that cognitive belief about themselves um, might help lead them to turn away support. And so if you can find a way to like make sure that they know that they're deserving of support just as anybody else and everyone else is going to get support too, then I think that can be really helpful because they try to be like our strongest soldiers in all of this, and that also takes a toll. Then we have the influence of socioeconomic status and marginalization. So, in addition to personal trauma and upbringing, an individual's socioeconomic background and marginalized status can profoundly impact their disaster response. So that might mean that people from a lower socioeconomic background may face heightened stress because of the disaster, because of lack of access to resources like transportation, housing, medical care, or social support. And that's going to amplify this feeling of helplessness and vulnerability. And it might actually exacerbate emotional responses like the anxiety and fear and despair that we would see. These communities have also experienced intergenerational trauma, such as like indigenous populations, refugees, and any racial minorities. They might react differently to disasters because of the historical context of displacement, violence, or oppression. And disasters might trigger memories of the past injustices, compounding on the emotional responses. So these individuals may feel distrustful of authorities and may be reluctant to seek help because of these negative historical experiences. People from marginalized groups, such as like racial minorities, LGBTQ individuals, and others, may have heightened emotional responses due to the fear of discrimination in response to the process and the lack of culturally competent resources. So their experiences of marginalization can lead to distrust in systems of support and create additional layers of stress during disasters. And there is something that, being aware of like the different types of trauma that people can experience. One of those types of trauma is institutional trauma. So it's basically a trauma that's implemented through an institution, which it could be a school system, it could be, the government, it could be, police, it could be any type of institution, the mental health industry, healthcare industry. Those institutional traumas can add up and lead to people not wanting support or being very distrustful of support when that happens because of what happened to them in the past. So then it's really important to really just kind of tie all of these things together and have an intersection of all of these factors at the same time. We want to really recognize that personal trauma, upbringing, professional or crisis exposure, they just don't exist in isolation. And so there's an interplay of these factors that creates a unique and a complex emotional response for each individual during these disaster situations. And I've just given an example, a couple examples, like the healthcare worker who grew up in a highly supportive family but experienced personal trauma in the past may handle the logistics of disaster response efficiently, but then struggle with the emotional triggers tied to their personal trauma. So, for example, they have this personal trauma in the past, they've experienced a disaster, and the disaster, they're like XYZ, they're on top of things, they've got everything, all logistics taken care of. But then after the disaster, they're noticing they're having more triggers from the previous trauma. So it's kind of like this new trauma has reactivated the old trauma, and now they're having to deal with the PTSD symptoms from that or the triggers from that. And so it might not be that they might not even be thinking about this recent disaster, but the recent disaster can bring up the old stuff that makes them have to work on it again. Another example is a veteran who's faced combat might demonstrate extreme calm and decisive action, but then later on, because of the delayed emotional processing, have flashbacks and guilt from that experience that they just had. So they can be calm in the moment, but then later on develop symptoms. In the last example, an individual from a low income background who has repeatedly faced crises may be highly resilient in the aftermath, but then might have prolonged anxiety about recovery because of the financial uncertainty and insecurity. So it can lead to a lot of different impacts, and it depends on the person how they're going to be affected. So, what can we do to build resilience? We're going to go over some coping skills. But first, we want to make sure that, we have that reminder that we want to utilize the critical incident stress debriefing, making sure that we're using that structured sessions for psychological first aid, of course, and being another one, for that disaster response, so they can talk through their experiences in a supportive environment and just help normalize these emotional reactions and provide the mental health resources. We can also give peer support networks, talking about like other people are setting up a peer support network where they can talk with people who've experienced something similar or know what it's like to have a mental health crisis. And then give them resources for professional mental health support. So that could be a therapist, a psychologist, it could be a psychiatrist, but giving them, access to mental health professionals and just that reminder that it's okay to go and get in therapy and talk about these things. And then just really us reminding people to practice that self-care and the recovery. Like no matter how they're feeling in the midst of that disaster, it's a really good idea to have a self-care plan or recovery plan so that way they can, really have an idea of like what are they going to do on a daily basis to make sure that they're caring for themselves. Because a lot of times when we experience a disaster, we're telling ourselves we're fine, we're fine, we're fine, we're fine, when really we're have slowly declining and not really noticing it because it's such a slow process where we're not practicing those self-care skills on a regular basis, and it just kind of leads to a slippery slope over time. And I think we can all take this out of the context of a disaster and trauma when we, have been eating healthy for a really long time and then, something stressful happens and we get out of the habit, if we're not getting back to our routine of that self-care and eating healthy and eating the things we want to, we're going to find ourselves back to what our comfort foods might be. And so I think it's just normal for us as humans to, if we're not being very intentional about what we're doing, then we can slip into our habits that maybe aren't as healthy for us as we would like. So there's two different types of coping skills that we can think about when we are responding to a disaster. And one of them is the problem-focused coping skills. So it can be saying like, we want to proactively develop a disaster response plan. And this is going to help reduce the uncertainty and fear. So this could have like having emergency supplies, knowing evacuation routes, having informed, ideas and information about potential hazards. It can be looking like action plans, like breaking down large tasks into smaller tasks or manageable steps during a crisis to help maintain the focus and reduce feelings of overwhelm. It could be like, hey, we're going to assign people these roles and these responsibilities within a team so everybody has clarity and efficiency. If problem-focused coping looks like time management skills, so prioritizing tasks and setting realistic deadlines helps to avoid unnecessary stress, and focusing on the most urgent needs first at the head gives people a very much like a feeling of control back to their life when they feel like they can take this piece and be in control. Then when you're in the midst of a disaster, things don't feel completely out of control, because if you're managing your time, you're managing more of your life. So it can be a really good coping skill for people who are coming out of a traumatic event or disaster. You can also give them problem solving techniques. So you're talking about like, how you can brainstorm solutions, how you can weigh the pros and cons, how you can implement the best approach, what of these approaches are going to give the best path forward during a stressful situation. So some people are very much, they're very cognitive based, they're very they intellectualize things. And this is going to, even if they're experiencing a lot of anxiety during a disaster, doing more cognitive, intellectual things with them is going to give them some of the sense of control, and it's going to feel very safe for them. If especially if they're very stoic and they don't seem like it's affected them very much at all, you kind of want to give them these tasks because they're going to be more likely to do these tasks versus, someone who's very stoic and being like, okay, you need to do deep breathing, and be like, well, I'm already calm. Why would I need to do that? And so it's hard for people who are very intellectual and very cognitive to do the emotion focused stuff because they don't have any awareness of their emotions yet. They might need that later, but in the moment, they might need to have more like these intellectual coping skills. So some of the other ones are, train like delegation, resource utilization, training education, making a recovery plan. So some people might not want to practice something run on the field. They might say, I want to make a plan for how I'm going to do, what am I going to do later on? And they're more likely to want to stick to that. So because they don't want to feel the feelings yet. Um, but they have a plan in order to follow when they start feeling the feelings, which can be really helpful for someone like that. And like a personal and recovery plan or self-care plan, it really needs to have like things on there like sleep, nutrition, hydration, social support, how they can maintain long-term resilience. Like, what are they doing? Like, how are they going to spend their time if emotions come up? Who are they talking to? What are the resources available? um, what are their top 5 coping skills that they want to use in whether that's problem solving or emotion focused coping skills. But then you have other people who are going to be very highly in tune with their emotions. And so with those folks, you're going to want to really use that as an asset because they're going to, as you're speaking their language. So if you kind of think of people who are very cognitive and intellectual, they speak the language of that. People who are very emotional in the moment, they're going to be speaking the emotion language. And so we have to respond to the language that they're speaking or showing to us at the time. And so people who are very much feeling a lot of feelings in the moment are going to want to benefit, or they're going to be feeling more understood and heard if you're responding to them through a more emotion focused coping. And that's going to be, making sure they've got good social support, they got people they can talk to about their feelings that they feel safe with. They can reduce their feelings of isolation. Like really like focusing on like who else can you talk to in your life? Like what do you want to share with those folks moving forward? And then sometimes people who are very much in an emotional state, they will also have what's called cognitive distortions. So some of those things is like it's my fault or this is hopeless, I can't handle this. These are all thoughts that create a lot of motion in people. And so if we can help them to rethink about or reframe those thoughts that are contributing to the emotional reaction, we can then reduce the emotional response. So, for example, if someone's like repeatedly saying, it's my fault, it's my fault, it's my fault, it can definitely be good for them to hear, it's not your fault. How could you have known this was going to happen? And a lot of times people are like, well, I just should have known. I can't tell you, but I should have known. I should have done something. And a lot of times that's when, I'm asking questions like, okay, so you're God and you knew that these things were going to happen and like you had this information ahead of time because I'm pretty sure you're human and you didn't have this information and there's nothing that you could have done to stop this because some people or some things are just bound to happen and there's not a lot of things that we can do to stop it beforehand. And we try our best, but we are still human. And so it's really kind of like bringing them back into their humanity because a lot of times people get into like the superhero identity or a God identity to thinking like, I should have been able to save them. I should have been able to do this. And it's really like saying, no, like you're still a human and we need to be reminded of our humanity and that you did the best that you could and it's not your fault. So we're helping them to really, if they are expressing these negative cognitions, really like asking questions that might help them to figure out that it's really not their fault, that they couldn't have stopped this from happening, and it did happen, and they're here now, so how are we moving forward? Because they have to move forward. And I really encourage people, they don't have to, use a traumatic experience to better other people or better themselves. It can just be like this really bad thing happened and I kept living. That can be enough. But some people really do find it helpful to say, like, okay, I went through this really terrible thing. I want to use it to help other people. So learning, like giving them hope that yes, right now it feels like it's pointless, but maybe there's a point to it, and that maybe they could help somebody else in the future, whether that's on a large scale or maybe it's just on a small scale. Maybe in the future they have a friend and they have somebody else that experiences the same thing, and they know how that person feels, and they can show up with a lot of compassion and empathy for somebody else. So another emotion-focused coping mechanism is journaling or emotional expression. Some people in the midst of a crisis, or if they feel like they can't find the words to talk, you can say, if it helps you better, would you want to write this down? Do you want to just write back and forth? Because some people, um, they don't know how to say the words without becoming overly emotional. And so writing it down can help them get the words out. And so that way you know what they're experiencing. Because some people, I mean, they're just having a flood of an emotion and they really can't talk through the crying and the sadness that they're feeling. So it can be helpful to write things down and kind of talk and communicate that way until they're able to be more regulated and talk some more. um, Acceptance and commitment. So acceptance involves recognizing and allowing the emotions to exist without trying to change them or suppress them. So it can just be saying, acknowledging the fear, acknowledging the sadness, acknowledging the frustration. It's all normal responses during a crisis. And this can really reduce the stress of trying to avoid or fight these emotions, because once they've accepted that it's okay to have these emotions, then they can commit to actions that align with their values, such as helping others or focusing on solutions, even in the presence of difficult emotions. So some people get stuck on it, like, I shouldn't be this upset because I wasn't like there when that happened, or I'm not justified to feel like this. And it's just hearing like it's okay to feel how you're feeling. You're having a normal response to a very abnormal situation. And that's what, you think of like a trauma response, you think of acute stress disorder, you think of PTSD. It's all the same. They're having a normal response to an abnormal situation. And we're just helping them get through this abnormal situation. And any response that they have is okay. Even if that's an intense rage, intense anger, intense sadness, like it is okay. No one is going to, as long as they're keeping themselves, their body safe to not hurt anybody, the emotions are not going to destroy them, no matter how overwhelming that they feel at the time. If nothing else, the more that we avoid the feelings, the more that they hurt us. And so expressing them is a really good thing in very healthy ways. Some people are going to need to move their body as a way of emotion coping. So it could be like they're going to go and they're going to go exercise, or in the midst of a disaster, it might say, like, I just need to pace. I just need to walk. I just need to do this because I need to keep moving my body. Moving my body feels like it's emotion, and you want to honor their body too, as much as you can in that environment, to allow them to do that, because they might feel like they're coming out of their skin and they have to move in order to regulate their body and regulate their emotions, and that's okay. Another emotion focused coping skill is self compassion and positive self talk. So that's really saying, like, anybody in the situation is going to feel like this. It's okay that I feel like this. I did the best that I can. I'm working through this slowly. It's going to take time. Most people are going to feel like this in the situation. Really just focusing on giving ourselves the same kindness that we're going to give to a friend or a loved one. And the last one is really talking to someone about reducing their exposure to negative stimuli. So we want them to make sure, like, for example, if I were working with someone that just went through a school shooting, I would want to make sure that they're not on social media and they're not watching the news. They shouldn't even be watching television right now. That's not safe in the midst after a disaster like that. It's very going to be very triggering and very overwhelming. and they really need to focus on what they experience without absorbing everything else from the outside social media networks and television. So I would really want them to limit their social media, limit their television, and just stick with more nature-based coping. I want them to be going on hikes and walks. I want them outside. I want them reading books. I want them journaling. I want them doing these other things to fill their time and process what they've been through. Because if they're on social media, if they are on the television and they're hearing people debate these talking points, or they're reading the comments on social media, that's going to contribute to either further victimization and traumatization, um, or it's going to compound on top of it. They're going to be re-traumatized with new things that people have said that are terrible and not helpful at all. So we want to give them that information too. Like it is okay to take a social media break for as long as they need to take a TV break as long as they need to, because their central focus is their recovery, and we don't need anything getting in the way of that. We don't need people who are unkind, who don't have the training, who don't understand trauma, who don't understand disasters, feeding them more cognitive distortions. And so it is okay to set this boundary and say to folks, like, you don't have to participate in social media right now, and you don't have to watch any television. We can live very good lives without all of that stuff. So those are some other coping skills, some tools that we can give people, but we do want to practice some mindfulness and grounding and breath work and tapping today. So mindfulness is the practice of bringing one's attention fully to the present moment with an attitude of openness and non-judgment. It involves the conscious observation of thoughts, feelings, body sensations, and the surrounding environment without trying to change them or avoid them. So, by focusing on the here and now, mindfulness helps individuals become more aware of their inner experiences and reduce emotional reactivity and manage stress more effectively. So, this practice can really foster a sense of calm and mental clarity and making it a valuable tool for coping in everyday challenges as well as like the immediate aftereffects of a disaster. So, one of the things I like to tell people, especially if they're having a flashback or if they're feeling like very unsafe in the moment, I'll say, okay, I want you to take a deep breath and I just want you to be here right now. Just bring your intention right here to this. Like if I'm in my office, like I am right now, I'll be like, be here right now. Oops. Be here right now. So you can hear me hitting a can and knocking it over. And and notice like that we're safe. Like everything's okay. Like right here, right now is all we have. And right here, right now, you are safe and you're okay. And we can just take a moment to really soak that up to say, like, I'm safe right now. And that can be a really big thing for someone who's just been through a traumatic event because the flashbacks, the reliving of the memories of what just happened, those can be intrusive. And so their mind is like constantly feeding them this and they feel very overwhelmed with it. So if you can get them to practice mindfulness and being right here, right now, then they're more likely to feel that sense of safety because a lot of times their mind is like still keeping them in that traumatic event because their mind is still trying to process what happened. It's still trying to make sense of it and trying to protect them because they've lost that sense of safety. So, one of my favorite mindful activities is actually called the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique. So, grounding is kind of like your way of getting into the moment. So sometimes we want to use a grounding technique in order to get us to the mindfulness. And a grounding technique like this one can really help you to attune. So, I want you to just, first of all, know that in stressful situations, our minds can race with anxiety. It can jump to worst case scenarios and lead us down all these roads of trauma or thinking about that we're not safe or that something bad's going to happen, or even just overwhelmed with stress and anxiety because of our day-to-day lives. So this activity is just meant to bring you back to the present moment by engaging the senses, by calming your nervous system and reducing feelings of overwhelm. So wherever you happen to be right now, I want you to take a deep breath in, and then we're going to hold it for a moment, and then we're going to exhale slowly. So And we're just going to begin taking our focus to the immediate surroundings. So I want you to look around and name 5 things in your head that you can see. So you might notice small details that you usually don't focus on. For example, the color of the wall, an object in the room, or something outside of the window. And you're going to find 5 of those things and you're going to name them in your head. And then I want you to go ahead and take your hands around you and pay attention to the texture of your clothing, the surface of your chair, the sensation of your feet on the ground. You can even touch the table if you have a table in front of you, or if there's a blanket nearby, or you can even like touch your other hand. But you want to feel 4 different things and bring that to your awareness. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to listen for 3 different sounds that you can hear. These can be loud, they can be soft. It might be like a hum from an air conditioner or a rustle of a paper. And then we're going to take our awareness to 2 things that we can smell. So, for example, I have something in my cup, I can smell that. And then you can even take, like, I've got a pencil right here. Take the pencil and smell it. It smells like a pencil. So it can be anything, because it doesn't have to be like a lemon or a scent or perfume, anything, because everything typically has a smell. If you can't find anything, like not anything at all, then you can think about your favorite relaxing smell. So for me, that would be coffee. And then the last thing you want to do is focus on one thing you can taste. So if you have like a bottle of water around you, if you have gum, if you have nothing in your mouth, just notice that you have nothing in your mouth to taste. And if you want to imagine something pleasant to taste, you can also do that. So then now that you've engaged your senses, just notice how you feel more in the moment than you did when you started. So this is something that you can do at any point in time. No one really is going to know what you're doing. Like a lot of times people aren't paying attention to us anyway. So it can be really helpful just to do it anytime we need to refocus our attention in the present moment. So when you're thinking about responding to a disaster, it can be a really good idea to have like a disaster response bag that has your MRC badge, it has, your volunteer shirt, but then you can also put like mints in there, you can put gum in there, you can put different textures, like so you already have things that people, or even like oils for people to smell, or different types of things that you can help people to say like, okay, do this and do this, and if you like gum, or if you don't like, or if you like mints, or they can just smell it. It can be something to give them that practice and how to do this in the present moment and bring them back. So I'll use this technique when someone might be dissociating in a session and I need them to be back in a present moment. So the breath work is really a lot what it sounds like. We'll do this one next. So this one is the art and just paying attention to our breath in the moment. So if you can keep your eyes open, you can close your eyes if you feel the need to. It's really up to you. And I always give the option to people to leave them open or close them, because people just have different levels of comfort and safety. And I want to make sure I'm providing with them the most safety that I can. So tell them that we're going to just go ahead and focus on breathing slowly through the nose. And we're going to count to 4 as we breathe. So we'll inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll hold our breath for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're going to exhale for 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we keep doing that. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. And you want to do this 4 to 5 times, just keeping that rhythm of inhale, hold, exhale, inhale, hold, exhale. And you want to keep doing that. And about 5 times is usually good for most people. Sometimes people always say, can I keep doing that? And I'm just like, yes, definitely. It's okay to keep doing that until you feel like you're ready and you feel like you're in a better state. This is the one that I really want to make sure that we do practice. So if you can do it along with me now, I would really appreciate that. But it's the tapping or EFT, emotional freedom technique. And so each of these different areas that we're going to be tapping. We're going to do it 5 to 7 times. And so we're going to utilize a statement for each one. So we're going to start with our hand. And so just on the side of our hand, you can use 2 fingers, you can use your whole hand, it's up to you. And you are instructing people on how to do this on themselves. So they're the ones touching themselves. You're not touching them. But you want to say, like, while you're tapping the side of your hand, this is what we're going to say. We're going to tap it 5 to 7 times. So, and you'll say that, ask them to say it with you. So, even though I'm stressed, I deeply and completely accept myself. Then we'll move to our eyebrows. So this stress that I'm feeling, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we'll go to the side of our eye. And on the side of our eye, we're going to say all of this anxiety. And then underneath our eye, I feel this tension, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then under our nose, it's overwhelming me, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then on our chin, the stress is so strong, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then our collarbones, we're going to say, I feel it in my body, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then under, kind of like a little bit underneath our armpit, we're saying, the stress is affecting me, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The stress is affecting me, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then on the top of our head, I release the stress now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so we can keep saying it with these different, like first acknowledging the stress, acknowledging how we feel, and then at the very end is we're going to release it through the top of our head while we're tapping gently. And so people can do this, 2 to 3 times, and hopefully just doing that once run through. I know I did it really quickly. You can feel some sense of relief and feeling like it is a little bit better just to acknowledge it while we're tapping and then releasing it while we're tapping. And so after you complete the sequence, making sure that you're checking in with them, like how do they feel? If when they think about what's stressing them or think about that anxiety or the tension, then you can have them say, like, on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is none and 10 is the most you can imagine. Where are you now? And you can kind of see if they shift a little bit. But doing an exercise like that can be really helpful too. And there's a lot of different ones that you can do, the different statements that you do while you're doing the tapping. It can be adapted to whatever they might be feeling. So instead of saying like this anxiety I feel, it could be like this sadness I feel, this grief that I feel, this anger that I feel. And then going through and doing the different sequence of tapping until they're releasing it through the crown of their head. Um, it can be really helpful. And I've included some EFT and tapping resources in the participants guide and then also at the resources at the end of this too. So based on all of these different coping mechanisms that we kind of shared, that's where we want to make sure that, just giving them the idea of a self-care plan moving forward, like what is that going to look like? Because I think people can say, yeah, I take care of myself, but okay, well, where is it written down? Like, how are we going to make sure that we are, you know, implementing it? We're checking in with ourselves. We're making the time for it. Because if we don't make a time for it, it's not going to happen. A lot of times we get busy. We all have everyday lives. We all get busy. And so, unless we are very intentional about our self-care practices, a lot of times it doesn't happen. So, the plan, it doesn't have to be extensive. It can be really easy, but really inexpensive. But it's really going to help us to give us direction and give us that intention that we need to implement it on a day-to-day basis. So that I want to leave enough time for questions, but I really just wanted to say thank you. I appreciate everyone, and I'll get to the resources too. So I've got these resources and the resources and then the training plan or the participant guide as well that Stephanie just mentioned in the chat. And so I want to open it up for questions if anyone has any.